All right, so today we're diving into something that I know can be a real pain point for anyone just getting started with Proxmox,
Oh, yeah.
and that is figuring out the best file system and storage setup for their home lab.
Hmm.
It can feel like you're just staring at this menu full of options that you've never even heard of before,
Right.
but luckily we've got an expert here to help us decode all of it.
Absolutely happy to be here.
So our listener is in the process of building their Proxmox home lab, and it looks like they've been doing their research.
Cut.
They sent over a bunch of articles, forum posts, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
What's the first thing that kind of jumps out at you from all this material that they sent over?
I think the fact that their focus on file systems first is really smart.
Okay.
It's a really fundamental decision
Yeah.
that impacts, pretty much everything else down the line.
Hmm.
Proxmox gives you a few choices out of the box: ZFS, LVM, XT4, or XFS, even Ceph.
Wow, that's a lot.
Each has its own strengths and weaknesses.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one.
Sure.
First up, ZFS.
Okay. The source material that our listener sent over mentions that it's great for data integrity, but needs a lot of RAM.
Yes.
Why is that?
So ZFS is known for being incredibly robust.
Okay.
It uses checksumming, like at every level,
Oh, wow.
so it can detect and often even correct data corruption, like before it even becomes a problem.
So it's like preventative.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Right.
So imagine you're running a database on a VM and there's, some silent data corruption happening with
Uh-huh.
ZFS. You're much less likely to have that database crash or have your data corrupted.
Interesting. So it's like having a bodyguard for your data,
Yes,
but that bodyguard needs to be well fed.
exactly. ZFS uses RAM for caching to speed up reads and writes,
Okay.
and also for holding metadata.
Mm.
That's why 8 gigabytes of RAM is kind of like the bare minimum.
Gotcha.
You can technically run it with less, but performance is going to suffer.
Okay. So ZFS, high protection, but hungry for RAM.
Yes.
What about LVM?
Okay.
The listener source material mentions LVM-Thin and snapshots.
I'm assuming those two are related somehow.
You assume correctly.
Okay.
LVM, or Logical Volume Manager, lets you create these flexible storage volumes
Okay.
that you can resize on the fly.
Mm-hmm.
Think of it like having adjustable partitions.
Okay.
And then with LVM-Thin, you can create these thin provisioned volumes,
Uh-huh.
which only use as much physical storage as they actually need.
Oh, that's cool.
Snapshots are another really cool feature.
Okay.
They basically let you freeze the state of a volume at a certain point in time.
Hold on. I need to wrap my head around this.
Sure.
So I could have a VM running, take a snapshot,
Mhm.
and then make changes to the VM.
Right.
And if those changes go wrong, I can just revert back to the snapshot.
Exactly. Precisely. It's like a safety net for your VMs.
Okay.
And because snapshots are incremental, they don't take up a ton of storage space.
Okay.
They only store the changes that were made since the last snapshot.
Okay, so that's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah.
So ZFS is the data integrity champ. LVM is the flexible friend.
I like that.
What about XT4 and XFS?
Right. Our listeners' notes mention them as being kind of like basic options.
They're like the tried and true workhorses of the file system world.
Okay.
Reliable, stable, and well supported.
Mm-hmm.
If your needs are pretty straightforward and you're not dealing with like mission critical data that needs that extra protection of ZFS,
Uh-huh.
then XT4 or XFS can be perfectly suitable choices.
So if I'm just running a few basic VMs for my own projects, I wouldn't necessarily need to go with ZFS or LVM.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
XT4 or XFS might be more than enough.
Gotcha.
It's all about choosing the right tool for the job.
Right.
Don't overcomplicate things if you don't have to.
And lastly, our listeners' research mentions Ceph.
Okay.
They seem a little confused about when they would actually need it.
Yeah, Ceph is designed for like high availability distributed storage.
Okay.
So think multiple Proxmox servers sharing storage across a network.
Oh, wow.
It's incredibly powerful, but also quite complex to set up and manage.
Okay.
For a single node home lab, it's almost certainly overkill. So unless they're running a small data center in their basement, they can probably cross Ceph off the list.
Pretty much.
Gotcha.
It's great technology, but it's not for everyone.
Right.
Stick with ZFS, LVM, or the XT4 XFS family for a home lab setup, and you'll be in good shape.
So we've got a good overview of the file system options.
Yes.
But where do we actually put all this data?
Right.
Where should the Proxmox installation itself live? And what about the storage for the VMs and containers?
Excellent question. Let's tackle that next. Okay, so let's talk storage locations.
Okay.
This is where things can get a little bit tricky, especially for beginners.
Yeah.
But don't worry, we'll break it down.
I'm all ears. From what I've gathered, the Proxmox installation itself should ideally live on an SSD or an NVMe drive?
right?
Why is that so important?
Good question.
Could I just install it on a regular hard drive to save some money?
Technically, you could,
Okay.
but trust me, it's not worth the headache.
All right.
Proxmox is really the heart of your whole virtualization environment. It's constantly accessing files, managing resources, responding to requests from your VMs and containers.
Right.
A slow hard drive will just bottleneck everything.
Gotcha. So it's all about speed and responsiveness.
Absolutely. Imagine trying to run your entire operating system off of a floppy disk.
Oh my gosh.
It would be excruciatingly slow.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
An SSD or NVMe drive really gives Proxmox the agility that it needs to keep everything running smoothly.
Okay, that analogy really paints the picture.
Good.
So we've got our Proxmox installation happily humming along on its speedy SSD.
Yes.
What about the VMs and containers themselves?
Right.
Where do they typically reside?
That kind of depends on the file system that you've chosen.
Okay.
If you're using LVM, local LVM is kind of the natural choice for VM storage.
Mhm.
It gives you the flexibility to resize volumes as your needs change,
Okay.
and also to easily create those snapshots for those just-in-case moments.
And what if we went with ZFS? Where would the VMs live in that scenario?
With ZFS, you would create a dedicated ZFS pool for your VMs. This allows you to take advantage of all those ZFS data integrity features,
Right.
and also its ability to handle those large storage volumes efficiently.
So LVM on local LVM ZFS on a ZFS pool.
Right?
Got it. Now, what about containers? Do they get their own separate storage space?
So in most cases, containers can actually share the same storage as your VMs.
Oh, okay.
They're typically much more lightweight than VMs, and they don't always demand the same level of performance.
But I'm guessing there are exceptions to that rule.
There are always exceptions.
Uh,
If you're running containers with very demanding workloads like databases or high-traffic web servers, then a dedicated SSD could give them a significant performance boost.
So it's a judgment call based on the specific needs of the containers.
Exactly. If you're just running, a few lightweight containers for personal projects,
Right.
they'll probably be fine just sharing storage with your VMs.
Okay.
But if you're really pushing those containers to their limits, then a dedicated SSD might be worth considering.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've got our Proxmox installation on an SSD.
Yes.
Our VMs and containers have a place to live depending on the chosen file system.
Right.
What's next on our checklist?
We can't forget about one of the most crucial aspects of any home lab setup.
And that is...
Backups.
Ah, yes. Backups, the one thing that everyone knows they should be doing.
Yep.
But often neglects until it's too late.
You're singing My Tune backups are your insurance policy against data loss.
Right.
And trust me, data loss happens to the best of us.
Oh, yeah.
It's not a matter of if but when.
I've definitely learned that lesson the hard way a few times myself.
I think we all have at some point.
But let's talk strategy.
Yeah.
What are the best ways to back up our Proxmox environment?
So the source material actually suggests a few different options. External hard drives or NAS devices for local backups.
Okay.
A Proxmox backup server or PBS for more sophisticated backup management.
Okay.
And then automatic snapshots for quick rollbacks.
Okay, let's break those down one by one.
Sure.
Starting with external drives or NAS devices.
Okay.
What are the pros and cons of that approach?
Well, they're simple, they're affordable, and they're readily available.
Go.
You can pick up a decent external drive or NAS without breaking the bank.
True.
They also provide that physical separation from your Proxmox system,
Mm-hmm.
which is a good thing in case of like a major hardware failure.
So if my Proxmox server goes up in smoke, I still have my backup safely tucked away on a separate device.
Exactly. However, external drives and NAS devices can be a bit slower than other backup methods,
Okay.
especially if you're dealing with large amounts of data.
Right.
And managing them manually can be a bit of a chore.
So good starting point, but perhaps not the most efficient or convenient solution in the long run.
That's a fair assessment. Now let's talk about Proxmox Backup Server, or PBS for short.
Okay.
This is where things get really interesting.
From what I've read, PBS seems to be like the gold standard for Proxmox backups.
It really is.
What makes it so special?
So PBS is designed specifically for Proxmox environments.
Okay.
So it integrates seamlessly, and it offers a ton of features that really just make backups a breeze.
Nice.
It uses incremental backups.
Okay.
So you're only backing up the changes made since the last backup,
Gotcha.
which saves you a lot of time and storage space.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about deduplication?
Right.
I've heard that's a big deal with PBS.
You're absolutely right. Deduplication is one of the key features that sets PBS apart.
Okay.
It essentially eliminates duplicate data blocks.
Okay.
So you're not wasting space backing up the same files over and over again.
Gotcha. Okay. So we're back, and I feel like I'm starting to get a much clearer picture of this whole Proxmox storage landscape.
Good.
We've talked about file systems. We've covered where to store our Proxmox installation, VMs and containers.
Yeah.
And of course, we've emphasized the importance of backups.
Right. And not just the importance of backups, but also, the different strategies we can use.
Right.
We've talked about external drives and NAS devices for local backups, and we've kind of touched on the power of Proxmox Backup Server.
Right. And you were about to explain how deduplication works with PBS.
Yes.
I'm still a little fuzzy on that.
Sure. So let's say you have multiple VMs that
yeah.
share some of the same files.
Okay.
Maybe they're all running the same operating system
Right.
with traditional backups. You'd end up backing up those same files multiple times,
Wow.
wasting a lot of storage space.
Yeah.
PBS, however, is smart enough to recognize those duplicate data blocks
Okay.
and only store them once.
That's like having a super efficient filing system
Yes.
that eliminates redundancy.
Exactly. And that can make a huge difference, especially if you're dealing with, large amounts of data.
Right.
It means faster backups, less storage space required,
Okay.
and overall just a much more streamlined backup process.
Okay. I'm sold on PBS, but what about those automatic snapshots we mentioned earlier?
Right.
How do they fit into the backup strategy?
So snapshots are kind of like your safety net.
Okay.
They capture the state of your VMs or containers at a specific point in time, allowing you to quickly revert back if something goes wrong. They're great for testing new configurations, experimenting with different settings,
Okay.
or simply just undoing a mistake.
So they're almost like incremental backups that happen automatically in the background.
You could think of it that way. Yeah, here's a thought to keep in mind. Don't be afraid to experiment.
Wow.
Proxmox is incredibly flexible and customizable. Try different configurations, explore different options, and find what works best for your needs.
Right.
Just remember to always have those backups in place before you make any major changes.
That's great advice. And speaking of advice, one thing that really stood out to me from all the research materials our listeners sent over was this emphasis on planning for the future. It seems like storage needs can change pretty dramatically as your home lab grows.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of setting up your Proxmox environment
Right.
and just go with whatever seems easiest or cheapest at the time.
Yeah.
But it's worth taking a moment to think about how your needs might evolve in the future.
Yes. So if I'm just starting out with a couple of VMs,
Yeah.
I might not need a huge amount of storage space right now.
Right.
But what if I decide to start experimenting with, more complex projects?
Yeah.
Or add more VMs down the road?
Exactly. You don't want to find yourself constantly running out of storage space
Right.
or having to migrate everything to a new system because you didn't plan ahead.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Think about factors like the number of VMs and containers you might be running in the future,
Okay.
the types of workloads you'll be putting on those VMs, and whether you'll need any specialized storage features like deduplication or high availability.
So it's all about striking a balance between current needs and future scalability.
Precisely. It might cost a bit more upfront to invest in a more robust storage solution,
Right.
but it could save you a lot of headaches and potentially even data loss in the long run.
Well said. On that note, I think we've covered just about everything there is to know about Proxmox file systems and storage.
I think so too.
Hopefully our listener is feeling much more confident and ready to tackle their home lab setup.
Absolutely. And remember, the Proxmox community is incredibly helpful and supportive.
Yeah.
There are tons of resources available online, including forums, documentation tutorials.
Yeah.
Don't hesitate to reach out for help if you need it.
And if you're feeling adventurous, don't be afraid to experiment.
Yes.
Just make sure you have those backups in place first.
Couldn't said it better myself. Happy virtualizing, everyone.
That's all for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time with another deep dive into a fascinating topic. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those backups running.